For those who are around my age or older, did you ever own a Walkman? Remember Walkmen? These were the revolutionary portable cassette players from the 80s. They were black, but the really cool ones were the water-resistant yellow sport ones. You'd hook them on your belt, plug in your headphones, and rock out to Madonna, Michael Jackson, maybe REO Speedwagon. The Walkman's triumphant arrival on American shores happened 40 years ago this summer. As Matt Alt wrote in The New Yorker, it was the gadget that taught the world to socially distance. Then the iPod debuted in 2001, and the rest is history. Nowadays, just about everyone has wireless headphones. Think about the last time you took a walk outside, assuming that you've been able to do that lately. How many people do you recall walking, jogging, or biking by themselves without something in their ear, whether it was connected to a wire or not? Whether podcasts, music, audiobooks, many of us carry a soundtrack with us wherever we go. Alt, in his New Yorker piece, argues this prepared us for the pandemic, but I don't think that that's quite it. I think the ubiquity of headphones points in some measure to the ways Americans have exacerbated the pandemic. I say this, mind you, as someone who loves listening to my headphones. There are few things that give me greater pleasure than going for a ride or a jog with my wireless headphones playing my own soundtrack. It's an escape, a protective shield against the noise pollution of civilization, a way to take pleasure or learning with us wherever we go without bothering our neighbors. The Walkman taught us how to be adjacent to humanity without being proximate to it. So let me explain what I mean by this. Adjacency in this frame is solitude but near others. Adjacency, as opposed to proximity, is not bad in and of itself. In fact, solitude is essential for most of us. But too much of it bears some collateral damage, I think, because empathy is a byproduct of proximity. My proximity guru is Brian Stevenson, the visionary founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. Stevenson says, proximity is a pathway through which we learn the kind of things we need to know to make healthier communities. Stevenson is talking about poverty for the most part, about how the haves tend to shield themselves from quote-unquote bad neighborhoods, from human suffering. That distancing can be dehumanizing. That dehumanization creates a tendency toward vilification. The McCloskeys, who I spoke of last Shabbos, are a good example of this. Hundreds of protesters marching through their street must be the enemy. How could they be anything else? That's why the work of IFO is so important to us here at Beth Am. We strive to know our neighbors. This also means aspiring to know our neighborhood. So that's why we're gathering, as Jonathan mentioned, on the steps of Beth Am tomorrow morning to sound the shofar. Bring a mask, we'll distance, but please join me to hear the shofar in person at 10 a.m. This is why we're asking folks to bring a flowering plant when you come to your open shul visit this month, to place on a neighbor's stoop. The pandemic is paradoxically showing how the covering of faces is an act of compassion and accountability. Revealing the face near others, well, quite the opposite. Anti-maskers, for example, aren't, to my knowledge, refusing to wear masks because they desperately want to smile at people, to talk to strangers, or to better interact with the most vulnerable. They are putting the most vulnerable at risk because they themselves don't want to be uncomfortable. Or worse, they don't want to be told what to do, God forbid. They are proximate to their friends, their families, but adjacent to everyone else. Many of us have been taught that if there's a bad part of town, you don't put your business there, Brian Stevenson says. But I am persuaded that you need to do the opposite. We need to engage and invest and position ourselves in places where there is despair. I think Stevenson's wisdom applies more broadly. I think proximity with our neighbors, any neighbors, is a Torah value. In other words, this is a Jewish topic. This week's Parsha contains more laws, as I mentioned, than any other. 74 distinct laws. But I want to focus on two short passages. The first is the Mitzvah of Lekket, of gleaning. Ki tiksor kitzircha b'sadecha, v'shachachta omer b'sadeh. When you reap the harvest of your field and overlook a sheaf in the field, do not turn back to get it. It shall go to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, in order that the Lord your God may bless you in all your undertakings. In the Mishnah, the overlooked sheaf is called shichacha, which literally means forgotten. And it's a mitzvah that can be ostensibly only done unintentionally because forgetting is autonomic. Remembrance, too, is involuntary. I imagine we all have memories that we would care to forget. But the end of our parsha insists that remembrance can also be intentional. Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. Remember evil and evildoers. This implies that we can will ourselves to forget as well. I submit to you that shichacha can only be done in contrast to the prescription for recalling evildoers. Remembering Amalek makes us weary of evil, better able to spot it and more capable of responding. Forgetting sheaves so that they may be collected by those who need them is about the equally important prescription of loving the stranger. Notice, too, proximity is a requirement for this mitzvah. Those in need interact with the same space as the farmers reaping their harvest. Sometimes the needy may not meet their benefactors. Sometimes they clearly do, as in the story of Ruth the Moabite, whose gleaning leads her to encounter Boaz, who eventually becomes her husband. Together, they are the progenitors of King David and one day Mashiach. Proximity is redemptive. The commandment of Lekket, of gleaning, is repeated 2 more times in our parsha, but in a different form. Beat down your olives, leave the rest for the ger, the yatom, the almanah, the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. Harvesting grapes, leave the remnants for the stranger, for the orphan, and the widow. And what is the justification for this? Well, it's about memory. Once again, v'zacharta ki eved hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim. Always remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore do I enjoin you to observe this commandment. You've been there. You know what it feels like to lack control over your own destiny, Jewish people, to have to depend on some master for basic sustenance. The brilliance of Lekket is that it upends the noblesse oblige paradigm, placing responsibility for collecting the food into the hands of the hungry. It's a paradox. What is proximity that evokes true empathy? It's to move out of the way and leave space for others to help themselves. But there's another passage in the Torah I'd like to highlight because I think it drives home what it means to be proximate to our neighbors, the centrality of proximity over adjacency. It's this line, Ki tavo becherem re'echa ve'achalta anavim. When you enter another man's vineyard, you may eat as many grapes as you want until you're full, but you must not put any in your vessel. When you enter another man's field of standing grain, you may pluck ears with your hand, but you may not put a sickle to your neighbor's grain. Rashi, citing the Talmud, claims this is about day laborers who have been hired to pick grapes, but I personally don't see it. There's nothing in the verse to suggest that it is anything other than what it seems. People in ancient Israel lived near one another, and people cut through each other's property, and when you do, Torah says, feel free to snack a little. Just don't go overboard. Your neighbor's farm is not a pick your own. It's like a buffet, right? Enjoy it, but don't stick the dinner rolls into your purse. What I love about this is that it's so contrary to the way Americans think about ownership. The Castle statutes, to which I referred last week in considering the McCloskeys in St. Louis, and their, I would say, warped view of property, represent a worldview in which my wall, my fence, is sovereign, almost sacrosanct. But Torah envisions a different sort of society in which we interact with each other's spaces. They're still ours, We still respect boundaries, but the boundaries are membranes, and membranes are permeable. And in the crossing and tasting of the fruit of our neighbor's land comes empathy denied when we shut one another out, when we incessantly put on headphones or blinders, or worse. Think of the famous Robert Frost poem, Mending Wall, a poem too frequently misunderstood and misappropriated to make exactly the wrong point. Frost imagines walking along a low rock wall next to his neighbor, each man on his side of the property line. And on a day we meet to walk the line and to set the wall between us once again, we keep the wall between us as we go. To each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are loaves and some so nearly balls we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game. One on a side, it comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Why do they make good neighbors? Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. Wearing headphones with your Walkman, writes Matt Alt, functioned both as a personal do not disturb sign and an alternate soundtrack to the cacophony of the city. This was a new form of human experience, engaged disengagement, a technological shield from the world and an antidote to ennui. Whenever nerves frayed or boredom crept in, one could just hit play and fast forward life a little. My friends, there's nothing wrong with a healthy dose of avoidance, of isolated or adjacent solitude. But if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's how much we humans are social beings. More than this, it's reminded many of us of the vast empathy deficit that exists in the United States. There is so much talking past and not enough talking with, so much misunderstanding, misrepresentation, and mistrust. The violence I alluded to last Shabbat, and that we experienced this past week with the police shooting of Jacob Blake and the subsequent murder of 2 protesters by a teenager's act of terror, are indicative of overlapping phenomena: systemic racism, toxic gun culture, and more. One phenomenon laid bare again and again, though, is the basic inability of Americans to see every other American in the fullness of their humanity. We in this country were hiding our faces from one another long before we put on masks. And we've been covering our ears since long before the Walkman took the nation by storm. The question for us now is whether we will notice just how isolated we've become. Will we forget what must be forgotten? Will we remember what we are duty-bound to recall? Will we take the risk of proximity? Will we insist on fewer fences? Is there a new soundtrack, a new American playlist we are brave enough to co-create? Shabbat Shalom.